One of the Berserk characters that isn't spoken of nearly as much as he should be Serpico, the former Herald of Arms for the Holy Iron Chain Knights and Lady Farnese's attendant / half-brother. The man has an interesting background and a set of skills, to say the least. He makes himself appear scarce, but he can take a man's head off in the blink of an eye, and any man that earns Guts' respect in combat is certainly one to watch out for. Serpico isn't nearly as built as the Black Swordsman, but he's still one of the finest fighters in all of Berserk, and a lot of that has to do with his anatomy. So, in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into it and break down everything that makes Serpico the master of the Sylphs, as well as Guts' best formal opponent to date. He grew up getting bullied, so he became quick and durable. Serpico's build and speed. Every character in Berserk has a deeply depressing backstory or has at least experienced some great tragedy in their lives. Isidro dumped his family and home village to chase the ideals of becoming a man and a warrior in the Middle Ages, which caused him to grow up well before his age in many ways. Yzma was abandoned by her mother at birth, and then her father passed away as well, leaving her orphaned on an island whose inhabitants hated her. Shirke was most likely orphaned at a young age as well because she's seen as an apprentice of Flora's for most of her life, and we're pretty sure Flora didn't give birth to her unless she managed to find a way to conceive immaculately. Even Farnese, one of the most privileged characters in the entire series, suffers from a loneliness that is too much to bear for a heart as young as hers. And the less we talk about Guts, Casca, and Skull Knight's trauma, the better it will be for all of us, because otherwise we'd be here all day. However, one side character with a tale that potentially rivals their own is Serpico, because despite growing up in the holy city of Ratanus, every day of his early life was a constant war. Serpico lived at the edge of Ratanus with his sickly, emaciated mother. She was a maid to a nobleman who blessed her with him and chastised him for acting like a commoner, blissfully unaware of the fact that a 10-year-old was already scrounging for scraps to ensure the survival of two people. Serpico's mother was suffering from early onset dementia, and her body was so weak that every time he gave her a massage, he could feel her bones. But she was his mother in the end, and he had a duty to her. So every day he'd go out into the city and get into fights with boys much larger than him just to fend off starvation. Even as a 10-year-old, Serpico had a lot of fight in him. The first time we see him getting bullied, he's set upon by 4 boys much bulkier than him who beat him down and kick him into the snow. Instead of playing dead or running away, Serpico chooses to retaliate by smashing one of their heads in with a rock, which scares them off enough to let him get on with his day. Fighting just to feed himself and his mother, walking out of his home with pride and then having it beaten out of him by 6 times his number. Serpico was stuck in a hell loop where his mother's expectations became the source of his torment as well as his guilt. He did everything he could to obey her wishes, but reality often got in the way of that. The second time we see him getting bullied, Serpico is bludgeoned by a half-dozen boys that are older than him, and somehow he still manages to survive. Though his pride wouldn't let him run away from the battle at the time, it was the routine abuse that shaped Serpico's endurance and quickness in his youth. From fending off bullies in the snow to nearly dying and being saved by a young noblewoman, only to become said noblewoman's page and be subjected to things like being chased by dogs and whipped off horses, Serpico's formative years were all about him developing the swiftness and the endurance he believed to be necessary for surviving in God's city as a godless man. Serpico has never been much of a theist, but he's got a keen mind, and he knows that acting like he believes is much safer for him than saying that he doesn't. Over time, Serpico goes from being a skinny boy of 10 to a lithe young adult, but his body now possesses muscles of a well-toned and well-defined martial arts fighter. He's not stocky like a weightlifter or any fighter that uses heavy weaponry, because speed and reflexes are the keys to his strength. Serpico is quick enough to pickpocket Guts mid-duel and use his own mini-bombs as a distraction against him. He executes this counterattack within a split second, and it catches Guts off guard for a moment, which is honestly a major achievement. The Black Swordsman's reflexes are so well-honed that he could crush a fly mid-air if he wanted to, and it was this maneuver of Serpico's that made Guts think he'd be a tougher fight than any pseudo-apostle in this world. Because he was used to getting beaten within an inch of his life in conditions far harsher than you or I could imagine, Serpico has developed the stamina and pain resistance to keep fighting as long as he needs to. Ever since joining Guts, he's become his right-hand man in battle because he's the only one who can keep up with his pace, at least to a certain extent. While speed and physical endurance shaped through trauma and training are Serpico's primary assets, they aren't the only ones he's got. You can argue that his actual physical strength plays a big role in his fighting skills, and so does his technique. The first sword of Bravos minus the thrown stuff. Serpico's strength and technique. Serpico is one of those characters that is deceptively strong. He's just a little bit taller than Farnese and definitely as skinny as her, but he can pull her entire body weight when the occasion calls for it. He doesn't have the raw power of a hacker or a slasher, but he has just enough strength to thrust his blade deep into his opponent's throats. That, combined with his natural quickness and endurance, make him the ideal candidate for learning the most famous Renaissance method of resolving disputes, fencing. Serpico's weapon of choice is a razor-sharp rapier that isn't unlike Arya Stark's needle once you get a good look at it. This weapon was typically used by the aristocracy during the 17th and 18th centuries as their primary dueling weapon. Many attempts were made at outlawing dueling even before the Renaissance, but there's something about the human desire to seek justice through violence. Dueling endured well into the 19th century and was only properly outlawed once modern society came into existence. However, the world of Berserk is set half a millennium before that, so it makes perfect sense that Serpico is a master dueler. His skill with a rapier is so refined that when he trains, he's able to stab half a dozen falling leaves sequentially with his sword and turn it into a leafy kebab skewer. He must have started training in the discipline as soon as he reached training age because, knowing Lady Farnese, he was aware of the kind of future that awaited him in her adolescence. Serpico was an extremely adept fighter too, because it's one thing to win a duel off the strength of one's back, it's an entirely different thing to force a draw so as to avoid unpleasantness in the future. At one point, Farnese made it a habit to challenge anyone that insulted her or her attendant to a duel, hoping that Serpico's skills would get her the bloodshed she desired. But Serpico knew the real way of the world and was unwilling to defeat or kill any of his opponents because he understood that violence only begets violence. So, he purposefully holds back each time he's made to duel a noble, and the kind of restraint and technical mastery it takes for an expert to make himself appear mediocre is beyond our comprehension. Farnese used to whip him for essentially throwing his fights because she knew he could win and he was drawing on purpose. Serpico had taken many wounds from his duels to keep up the pretense of his inadequacies, but he knew damn well that he could have killed every last nobleman that he was pitted against. We understood this in the brief exchange he had with Guts in chapter 125. After feigning inferiority to the man and getting Farnese away from him, Serpico made it seem like he was about to leave Guts and Puck in peace. But then, he got a menacing look in his eye and he drew his rapier like a whirlwind, which managed to score a nick off of Guts' face. Serpico simultaneously dodged Guts' Dragon Slayer draw, which left him unharmed but took the right tip of his boot completely off. Guts was impressed with Serpi's draw style and wanted to fight him then and there, but Serpico took his leave and followed Farnese out of there. The Black Swordsman had killed countless apostles by the time he met the attendant, but something about his human skills excited him to the point that he was disappointed Serpico cut their duel short. He would get the opportunity to test his strength in a full fight at a later point in the manga, and that would only further prove our point, that Serpico is basically the Sirio Pharrell of Berserk, minus all the thronesy political intrigue. The rapier was a weapon mostly used to resolve civil disputes. It was never intended to replace traditional longswords in actual combat scenarios, but it gained popularity thanks to the fact that it was uniquely suited for dueling. Serpico, however, can use it in any kind of combat situation, and that makes him more lethal than a traditional swordsman. Rapiers are often useless in the face of plate armor, but Serpico has the skill to find the open spaces between its joints and exploit them to his heart's content. His skills have been forged in the flame that was Farnese's social life, because at first, he fought to defend her honor, and then he fought to defend her person. As the years rolled by, Farnese ended up joining the Holy Iron Chain Knights as its ceremonial commander, and Serpico, having orders to remain by her side, joined up as her Herald of Arms. Though the Holy Iron Chain Knights rarely participated in actual warfare, Farnese's religious zealot act had put a massive target on their backs. Her heretic hunts could prompt any of the targets' loved ones to retaliate in revenge, so Serpico had to be alert at all times. He shadowed her like, well, a shadow, and he kept her out of harm's way even when it was headed straight towards her. That's because as good as he is with a blade, Serpico's actual weapon is his mind. He has the mind of a computer at a time when watches didn't exist. Serpico's best weapon, aka his brain. Now, we know that anatomical advantages don't exactly include things like intelligence because that's a cultivated trait for the most part, but the brain is a part of the human body, and intelligence is one of the primary factors through which we measure its working ability. Serpico's mind is as much a part of his skills and techniques because without it, he wouldn't be able to apply them efficiently, would he? His quick and strategic thinking has revealed itself to be a game changer in the 3 times he lifted the veil of aloofness. For the people who don't know what Serpico is all about, they see him and think he's a goofy guy who's disinterested in pretty much anything that isn't amusing to him. His introductory scene shows him ribbing his vice commander by claiming a praying mother they'd crossed on their travels was just his type. He often acts as though he has no idea what's going on or why he's being involved, but the truth is that it's all an act. Serpico is an intense, calculating, and highly motivated individual on the inside, and he keeps up the goofy act to deliberately make people underestimate him. A man that isn't seen as a threat is a man you won't try to hurt. Violence begets violence, and Serpico has no desire to contribute to that cycle. He had already been forced to burn his mother at the stake in the name of God and loyalty to Farnese, and though he was terrified of fire ever since, he never told anyone close to him. It's both depressing and impressive to think that his self-control was so refined that he could stare at heretic burnings long enough to convince his comrades he was devout like them. Anybody that can be that calm outwardly while they're freaking out on the inside is bound to be a tricky opponent, and Serpico is way more than that. He was the reason that the Holy Iron Chain Knights managed to capture Guts in the first place, not because he beat him in a duel, but because he'd used his brains to incapacitate the man. Serpico threw a broken branch onto an arrow sticking out of Guts' leg when he tried to grab Farnese because he knew the pain would stun him just enough for his lady to get a stab in. He never took ownership of this fact because he knew it would be better to let Farnese think she'd done something because Lord knew that the girl needed it. His second and third duel attempts with Guts are where his genius truly shines through because despite all his skills, Serpico is correct in saying that he's no match for Guts' raw strength. He saw the guy cut down dozens of fully armored knights like he was practicing with training dummies, and he knew from the get-go that a proper duel was out of the question. The more space you gave Guts, the more advantages he possessed, simply off the fact that he could swing Dragon Slayer around. Serpico might be able to carry the blade on his person with his strength, but he will never be able to use it like Guts does because of its sheer size. Close quarters combat was the only solution he could find to this range problem, but not just any kind of close quarters combat. Serpi needed it to be a place where Guts couldn't draw his sword and swing it around freely, ideally forcing him to rely on his other weapons. Now, yes, he did have an arm-mounted rapid-fire crossbow on him, but making it work was a process too slow in close quarters where every millisecond counts. In their second duel, Serpico managed to corner Guts on the steep ledge of a cliff. This path was the only safe escape route from Heretic's den, and Casca had gone ahead of him, but Serpico managed to delay Guts just a bit longer. He tried talking first, claiming he just wanted to have a word with the Black Swordsman, but Guts immediately shot arrows and threw bombs in his direction. Serpico avoided them by climbing down the side and then shooting himself back up where he thrust his rapier into Guts' face. Years of experience made the Black Swordsman's reflexes kick in, but Serpico was unrelenting. He kept Guts from drawing his sword or his crossbow because he knew drawing was the key to defeating him. He had selected this ledge for their encounter because the environment worked against Guts. With such cramped footing and a death plunge on one side, even removing Dragon Slayer from its sheath could prove fatal, and moreover, Serpico's plan was to cut off his movement entirely. Guts understood the depths of his skill when he kept changing his attack pattern on the fly, and if he had time to spare, maybe he'd have tried figuring out a way to counter him as a warrior, but because he didn't, he took a flurry of thrusts to predict the trajectory of his attacks and then caught his blade with his good hand. The momentary shock allowed Guts to shatter the blade with his metal arm, and he almost killed Serpico with his crossbow, but the wily duelist outwitted him yet again. He immediately ducked the barrage of arrows, pickpocketed Guts, and then used his mini-bombs against him to make a quick getaway. Just the amount of hand-eye coordination required to execute such a precise and rapid retreat maneuver should tell you how in sync his mind and body were. Despite only having moments to prepare the ambush, Serpico set up everything perfectly, which is yet more evidence of his strategic genius. Sure, he didn't win, but he probably never expected to. He's a frank guy for his quiet disposition, and he acknowledged Guts' strength outright. He knew that if he wanted to beat him, he needed more control over his environment, which culminated in their final battle in the Colonnade Chamber. Filled with equidistant pillars that impeded movement and drawing ability, Serpico gave it his all in trying to defeat Guts. While he might possess the strength to shatter stone, Guts would still need to break through each pillar in the chamber to reach Serpico, and the delay in his momentum is what the duelist gambled his entire approach on. He used his environment perfectly and landed several hits on his body, but in the end he couldn't land a single lethal strike. Even his fail-safe plan to have the ceiling cave in on Guts ended up backfiring when the swordsman's reflexes redirected the debris towards him. Serpico did everything humanly possible to stop a man that ate inhumans for dinner, and he was proud of his defeat, such as it was. He thought Guts didn't deem him worthy of the Berserker armor's use, but we saw him hold it back at one point in the fight, which proves that Serpico did push him to his limits. This analytical ability of his became crucial to the Black Swordsman's party's survival, and his knowledge of history and household became advantageous as as well. Serpico knew the coat of arms of every nation allied with the Holy See, and he could prepare the most delicious meals from even meager supply. Overall, he was a jack of all trades and an extremely functional tool to have in one's arsenal, and all of that is thanks to his brain. He might never reach the raw strength of Guts, but he doesn't have to, because his skill is unique to him, and he can use it to defeat him in other ways. On a human level, Guts clearly outclasses Serpico in every way, but once we involve magic in the conversation, perhaps things favor the latter, because out of all the fighters in the Black Swordsman party, Serpico is the one who has adapted to his elemental style the best. The Chosen One by the Sylphs of the Wind. How Serpico became a natural magic user. In Chapter 203, we're introduced to the concept of elementals as a means of giving our protagonists a bunch of magical upgrades. Seeing as the astral world had begun overlapping with the physical world at this time, we'd say such an addition was necessary. While Casca and Farnese believed silver chainmail and daggers would protect themselves, Isidro and Serpico got proper weapons blessed with the power to channel elementals. Isidro got the salamander dagger, which channels the power of fire, much like his nature. Serpico, meanwhile, received the Sylph sword and the Sylph hood, two items that put his fighting potential on a whole nother plane. Serpico had been restricted by the strength of his flesh in his fights with Guts. He was smart and quick, but so was he, and their strength difference was too much to overcome naturally. However, with the Sylph cloak and sword, he could finally outmaneuver Guts in whichever way he wanted. With the cloak, he could channel the atmospheric current and levitate in whichever direction he chose, and with the sword, he could send a cutting gust of wind in his target's direction, which would slice through them without the blade ever touching them. These two power-ups, combined with Serpico's wily nature, make him the perfect warrior of the wind, and he proves that the first time he uses them. The Black Swordsman's party's mission to the Enoch village starts off as soon as they get there, because a troll raid coincides with their arrival. Serpico, understanding the basic rules about how the Arcana of Invocation works, beseeches the Sylphs to grant him their power each time he uses the sword or cloak, and in doing so, he impresses even a prodigy like Shirke. Serpi had always been a perceptive guy. When he was chasing Guts after he kidnapped Farnese, he noticed that so were a bunch of dead spirits. He wasn't shocked when he saw Puck on his shoulder, unlike his mistress, and he adapted to Guts' life of terrors at the drop of a hat. Serpico was a man who believed in adapting himself to whatever role was best suited for his goals, and that flexibility made him an extremely reliable companion, especially in matters of combat. Shirke was shocked that Serpico managed to figure out how to fly with the Sylph cloak his first time using it, because she didn't expect him to be so naturally adaptable. But that's Serpi's whole thing. He proves he's more than capable of helping handle low to mid-level astral entities with his sword and cloak when he protected Enoch's villagers from trolls and a Kelpie. The latter revealed the full extent of Serpico's latent potential because he came out on top in his first ever magical battle. The Kelpie was a creature that could manipulate water elementals to fire water balls at its enemies and erect a water wall to defend himself. Serpico tried getting through that wall by channeling more Sylph energy, but then the Kelpie caught him in one of them. Serpico's quick thinking was the only thing that saved him that day, because he realized he could blow the water away from him by creating a mini typhoon. He repeated this with the Kelpie, managing to break through its defenses, and that was one of the best demonstrations of magic use in the entire series. Serpico would go on to gain such mastery over his relics that they helped him survive a battle with the strongest sorcerer in the world, as well as the strongest apostle in the world. While he didn't get involved in the fight with Daiba initially, Serpico did eventually fly in to perform hit-and-run tactics on the Kundalini's main body, or Daiba's, whichever he could strike first. While Guts unleashed a flashy offensive, Serpico used the distraction to attack Daiba, and it worked the second time they tried it when Serpi got the real body of the Kundalini instead. He also saved Guts from imminent death by creating a wind vacuum just before they were struck by Emperor Ganishka's lightning. Although all of the electricity wasn't dissipated because Serpico's body went numb on impact, the threat of death was largely removed, and it was largely down to Serpico's quick thinking and quicker movement. When combined with Shirke's knowledge of the astral world, Serpico can truly become the best wind dancer in the world because his fighting style heavily complements his choice of elemental. His skills are refined enough to give Guts himself a run for his money, and while he's already proven himself to be indispensable to his comrades, his true purpose remains undefined. Serpico's only desire has been protecting his half-sister at any cost, and perhaps he will die protecting her. It would be a fitting end for a man who's been doing that job ever since he was 10 years old, but if that is to be his fate, then at least he's got the anatomy to see it through to the bitter end, because we don't realize it, but that boy Serpi, strong AF. Marvelous verdict! And speaking of realizing things, we got to apologize to you guys because that's all we've got for you for this video. Serpico is one of our personal favorites from Berserk, which is why we were so thrilled to present this video to you guys. Let us know what you think about it and who your favorite Berserk character is down in the comments below, and maybe tell us about your favorite Serpico moment. We want to hear it. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more Berserk content, because we all know that the wait for chapter 379 will be long and painful, but as always, you just gotta keep on struggling, strugglers. See you next time.